right, so welcome back to another message on the life of Jesus. If you remember, last time we left off where Jesus and three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, were in the mountains in the region of Caesarea Philippi. When Jesus took these three with him to pray, and in the process, they witnessed Jesus transfigure as he spoke with Moses and Elijah. Now, at some point while they were in the mountains, the remaining disciples found themselves in the middle of a situation which was quite puzzling for them. But in the meantime, Jesus and his three disciples have made their way down the mountain, and they come upon this scene. It's the scene we find in Matthew 17, verses 14 through 23, also in Mark 9, 14 through 32, and Luke 9, 37 through 45. We're actually going to be borrowing from each of these accounts as we try and paint a picture of what happens. I have divided this message into two parts, so let's dive into part one. The scene picks up on the next day when they had come down from the mountain, Luke 9:37. And then Mark tells us, and when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and scribes arguing with them, Mark 9:14. Now it's interesting because the term translated arguing can be translated with the words examine and discuss, dispute, debate, or question. So which word is it? Well, the scribes were among the religious leaders who always seemed to be looking for a way to corner and discredit Jesus. It seems that they have seized on an opportunity to use his disciples as a way to do this, and so arguing, I believe, is appropriate here. So in the midst of this arguing, Jesus shows up. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. Mark 9:15. So the people see Jesus coming and turn their attention towards him. It's because he's like this celebrity that has showed up in the middle of a confrontation. And all of a sudden, what was going on was not as important or interesting. Some might have thought that Jesus would fix or settle the dispute. He'll take care of this. But regardless of what people were thinking, when Jesus showed up, it changed everything. And I think people knew it would. So in Mark 9:16, Jesus asked, "What are you arguing about with them?" Then let's look at Luke and how Luke describes what happens next. In Luke 9:38, and behold, a man from the crowd cried out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son," kind of like a doctor would with a patient, "for he is my only child." And the father goes on to say, as Mark says in 9:17, that he has a spirit that makes him mute. And if you go back to Luke chapter 9, verse 39, the father continues, "And behold, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out." And Mark says in Mark 9:18 that it throws him down. Obviously, this is a picture of a sudden attack out of nowhere. And he goes on to say that it convulses him so that he foams at the mouth. And Mark 9:18 adds that he grinds his teeth and becomes rigid, and it shatters him. The word shatters here in the New American Standard translates this as mauling or bruises. So it bruises him and it will hardly leave him. The New American Standard says it this way: with difficulty does it leave him. All in all, this is a very vivid picture of what happens when the father's son is attacked by this demon. See, it resembles what it might look like if suddenly someone next to you dropped to the ground in a violent seizure. And then the father goes on to say in Luke 9:40, "And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." So while Jesus and three of his disciples are up in the mountains, this is the situation that is unfolded on the ground with the remaining disciples. And at some point, this man came to the disciples of Jesus and asked them to cast out the demon that was constantly attacking his son. The problem was they could not do it. Then I believe as a result, it seems the scribes were using their failure as a way to discredit Jesus, hence all of the arguing. Then Luke 9:41, Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation." Now remember, Jesus is speaking about people of his time here. He uses the word generation. "How long am I to be with you and bear or put up with you? Bring your son here." Now, a few things to note from this verse that might help paint a better picture for you. First, the word faithless. Faithless is a Greek word that means unbelieving or untrustworthy. It's a word used to describe people who are refusing to trust where they ought to trust. Secondly, the word translated twisted is a compound Greek word, which is two words that are put together to make one. First, it's made of a Greek preposition that deals with the means by which something is done. We might say, for this reason, or therefore. And then the second word is a verb, which means to change, to reverse, to go backwards. So when you bring these two words together, it's used figuratively to describe something that has been misinterpreted, corrupted, or turned against. And this is why it might be translated as perverse or twisted. Now, thirdly, when Jesus makes this statement, he is not singling out anyone specifically, as I mentioned before. I say this because he says, "Oh, faithless and twisted generation." When he says generation, he is speaking about the people of his time in general. Now, just consider how we generalize people by labeling those who come from different time periods, right? We have the lost generation, we have the greatest generation, and baby boomers. I'm actually considered part of the Generation X. Then we have millennials, and now we have Generation Y, or the new silent generation, as some have put it. When we talk about these generations, we are generalizing a people who are defined by a period of time, by things that described and shaped that period of time. We're talking about people who have themselves been shaped or affected by the events of their time. And of course, this is a generalization and should be taken as such. And the same with what Jesus says here. The people before him are people who have been affected by, have been molded and shaped by their culture, by their times, in such a way that they are struggling with what's before them. Now, consider the characters in this scene in light of all of this. Let's start with the scribes. This group of people had a long and important history in the nation of Israel. They held various important official public offices, from military all the way to Secretary of State. They prepared decrees by the king that were issued by the king. They were men of high authority and influence. Now, some scribes never attained to this sort of status. Some were nothing more than writers, and the majority of those were just simply Levites. But after captivity, Israel pretty much lost their independence, and so the scribes focused more on the law, and their awareness of the law and the knowledge they held is what set them apart from everyone else. They were responsible for not only making copies of the law, but teaching the law as well. Now, in the New Testament times, the generation Jesus is speaking of, scribes seem to have been a part of the Pharisees, and were concerned with not only the law, but also the oral traditions that supplemented the law. These scribes, arguing with the disciples, were considered public teachers and would have a vested concern with what Jesus was teaching and the disciples that he was training. And regardless if they were more concerned about holding to their political power, or if they were genuinely concerned about the nation of Israel remaining in God's good graces so they could once again gain their independence, maintaining orthodoxy was extremely important to them. And they would seek out and look for ways to discredit, to cast doubt on anything or anyone who presented anything other than that which is orthodoxy. Now, consider the disciples of Jesus. These men who were sought out by Jesus himself. I'm not sure anyone would have put together a bunch like this, but Jesus did, and he did it on purpose. First of all, the way Jesus did this was not normal. The typical way a person became a disciple of a rabbi was first by seeking the rabbi out, and then the rabbi would determine the eligibility of the person. See, the rabbi had to have confidence that this person could one day truly represent him and might eventually rise to the status of a rabbi, further cementing his legacy in future generations, as he has done for the line of rabbis that he himself might have come from. And so, if a rabbi accepted you, he was saying that he had at least some confidence that you could succeed. And Jesus didn't wait for anyone to come to him, though. He went on and he went out and he hand-selected a group of men who could not be more different, many of which you would never expect to even have a desire to one day be a rabbi. And while at least two of these men were previous disciples of John, we have fishermen. We have some were men of intense passion and zeal and political activists, we might say. We have a tax collector, we have a thief, and we have some ordinary, quiet men. And when Jesus chose these men, he was saying, I believe you will be able to do what I do. And with their acceptance to be his students, they were taken out of their comfort zones and thrust into a new way of thinking and perceiving. They witnessed all the amazing things Jesus did. They listened to his teachings, which at times probably seemed utterly different than anything that they had ever heard, or maybe even considered. They were even given the ability or authority to wield the same power that they saw Jesus use. Well, could their lives have turned out any more different than they had ever imagined? These were men who were raised under the Roman occupation in the midst of chaos and unrest of many Jewish sects. They learned to navigate their social structures and no doubt either had or were settling into what they had thought was going to be the rest of their lives. They could have never foreseen their present reality. Now, they're following a man whom they believe to be the Messiah. And they are following him into the tension and the pressure from the religious leaders and their agendas and the reality of the existence of people Jesus described as sheep without a shepherd. And now their rabbi has been talking about suffering and dying at the hands of these religious leaders. And what's this rising from the dead thing? And really, can it get more intense than this? No wonder they're struggling, and now they can't cast this demon out. What's happened? Have they lost the ability to do this? And then they have the voices of the scribes planting seeds of doubt in this moment. You can only imagine the thoughts that have begun to creep in. So you have the scribes and you have the disciples. But you also have this father and all the other people like him. See, they are doing whatever it takes to survive. Things are happening to them that they don't totally understand. They were led to believe that disease and sickness were judgments from God. And they can't seem to live up to the standards that have been set up by the holy men of their time. And so no doubt this simply reinforces their beliefs that God doesn't love them. I imagine what they're going through as a result of their social structure and their physical and emotional circumstances. It's like a never-ending cesspool of misery and desperation. It's like a living hell. Now, before them, they have a man who has done some extraordinary things and has brought relief and a new life to those he has touched. And he has some disciples who are being trained by him to do the same things that he can do. But at least in this man's situation, they're not able to do this. So does this mean that Jesus will not be able to do it either? I imagine this man might be sinking from hope into a reality that there will be no reprieve from the suffering. And all the while, you have the voices of the scribes discrediting Jesus. Again, the seeds of doubts are beginning to sprout. And finally, you have Jesus. You have Jesus who says, how long am I to be with you and bear or put up with you? And when Jesus says this, he's saying this in light of the doubt and disbelief he so often encountered and would have to once again contend with in this situation. And so Jesus says, bring your son here. In Mark 9:20, and they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, that is Jesus, immediately it convulsed the boy and he fell. Luke 9:41 says it slammed him to the ground. And he rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Now literally, when the boy is coming to Jesus, the spirit sees Jesus and it responds. It responds by attacking the boy and slamming him to the ground, making things more difficult. Now, I have to stop here because you need to see the symbolism in this. How many times do we experience something like this? Or we see others experience something like this? You see, I think what's going on with this man's son actually mirrors our own struggles at times. Consider what can happen when we finally decide to turn to Jesus. It could be when we first decided to trust in Jesus, or it could be in light of some difficulty we're facing when we suddenly realize that we're going at it the wrong way. or just any time we're trying to change and be more like Jesus, sometimes it can be a struggle. Even we are convinced that this is the thing to do. Why is it such a struggle? Because, as the saying goes, old habits die hard, making it difficult at times to stay true to the path of Jesus. Right? Like in moments of weakness, doubt and uncertainty can creep in, which can cause us to back up, to reverse from the path Jesus has made for us. Now, how many times have you decided it was time to address a certain issue, or deal with a problem, or get help with that thing that all of a sudden things seem to get much harder? Maybe some things that have been repressed for so long begin to surface, and we have to face what we have run from for so long. That can be hard. And the process can cause us to question or even doubt the need to deal with it in the moment. And as a result, we just go back. We go back to where we were before, to what we've always known. See, there's this resistance, there's this tension, like a battle is being fought. And the battle that is being fought is a battle against change. But it's a fight you have to jump into. You have to take it up, because it's through the fight that victory is won. See, the process you go through is what sets things in order. It corrects the path, and it helps us to realign our hearts with God. And in fact, it's very similar to what the disciples were going through in this particular scene, and the battle that they are going to continue to fight all the way through to the resurrection. So if we go back to Mark 9:21, and Jesus asked his Father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. Again, consider many of our struggles we have later in life might actually have roots in the things that happened to us as children. See, our hearts are molded and they're shaped at a very early age by our experiences. And oftentimes, by the time we actually realize that anything is wrong, it's been many years later, many experiences later, and the things we are contending with are just merely surface. And the real culprits go back years, but it has stuck with us for all this time, piling on these other issues or habits from us being just simply battered and bruised, and we feel it too. We just don't know what to do. And then in Mark 9:22, the Father adds, and it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Now, remember the situation and what the Father has gone through. The failure of the disciples to heal his son. No doubt it has affected the Father's belief or confidence that anything could be done. And so he says, but if you can do anything, you can hear the desperation. He is wrestling with his son's condition, with the disciples' failure, and he responds in light of all of this. In Mark 9:23, Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. In other words, Jesus hones in on the man's words, if you can. Maybe almost like a question, right? Like, if you can? This man is struggling, though, and he is uncertain. The doubt is there, and his statement is almost like a challenge, I guess. Like, I don't know if you can, but if you can, will you please help? Then Jesus turns it back to the Father in what seems like a challenge. Maybe we might say it this way. I can, but do you believe? And then Mark 9:24 says, immediately the father of the child cried out. Now some manuscripts say with tears. So he cries out and he said, I believe. Help, literally continuously help my unbelief. Now the Greek word here, translated help, it's made of two words as well. One means a cry, and the other means to run. And so it's like he's saying, come running, I am crying for help. What a vivid picture of this man's heart, both spiritual and emotional. And doesn't this also, though, relate to our own cries of desperation that come from our own struggles? As I've mentioned before, when we don't know what else to do, when the doubts set in and we begin to reverse our course back to what we've always known, instead of doing that, all we need to do is cry out to Jesus. And when we do this, expect him to come running. He will. And it will be manifested through answered prayer, through another person's actions or words, through a small message that comes out of the blue, through something that suddenly stands out in our minds. And when we follow that thought, it takes us to where we need to be. Now, remember, our cry for help it's not a one-time plea. It's a plea for continuous help that continuously comes as we journey, as we walk closer to Jesus. Then Mark 9:25 says, and when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, and so the crowd is growing rapidly and around this situation, Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, that is the spirit, came out. And the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. See, in this moment, he arose to a new life, a new way of existing, just like all those who follow Jesus. Now, but why were the disciples not able to cast this demon out? What was going on with them? For that, you'll have to wait for part 2. Until then, grace and peace. We'll talk to you soon.